January 1983. The front lines of Europe are steadily diminishing in the face of the Beta onslaught. Humanity has suffered a decade of violence under the extraterrestrial threat. Even with the advent of the tactical surface fighter and its burgeoning role on the battlefield, nothing can stop the seemingly endless horde. Now, the German Democratic Republic and its citizens are soon to endure the brunt of their westward advance. The soldiers of East Germany's National Volksarmy maintained a series of trenches and fortifications along the German border. For years, this absolute defense line was engaged in a prolonged battle of attrition against the invaders. But 1983 would give way to one of the most turbulent upheavals ever to occur during the history of the European front. Since their initial landing at Kashgar in 1973, the Beta had spread in every direction, destroying nation by nation as they went. Wherever they expanded, the alien threat would establish their towering hives, devouring the landscape. They burrowed deep into the earth below, gathering resources for unknown purposes. By 1976, their fifth hive had been established at Minsk, in Belarus. Designated as Objective 5, this location would directly threaten the stability of all of Central Europe. During these years, the German people had been divided between East and West. When the Second World War had concluded with the use of nuclear weapons on German soil, the country had been split in two: the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany, and the German Democratic Republic, otherwise known as East Germany. Adhering to the resources and influences of NATO and UN powers, West Germany thrived in terms of military power and international alliances. East Germany remained under the sway of the Soviet Union as a member of the Warsaw Pact. Adopting a socialist model of government, the GDR would see a vastly different style of life than their Western counterparts. To reinforce this difference, the capital of Berlin was divided with a wall, and Germany became a battleground of ideologies between the US and Soviet Union. This Cold War did not end with the Beta landing at Kashgar, yet it fueled a grudging parley between NATO and Warsaw Pact militaries. After the establishment of the Minsk Hive, both groups of nations recognized the need for international cooperation and combined their forces for the first time in a joint effort to repel the Beta. The Allied forces would launch Operation Paleologos in 1978. For 2 grueling months, NATO and Warsaw Pact forces advanced upon the Minsk Hive from east and west. Fighting a ground campaign across multiple countries, they eventually managed to besiege the Hive itself. Their combined forces, primarily composed of armor divisions with TSF units in support, were able to advance on the Hive from the south. But all attempts to infiltrate and capture it were met with failure. The famous Volk Regiment would advance deep into the underground shafts of the Hive, gathering invaluable data for humanity. But when the Beta counterattacked in full, only 14 pilots would escape the Hive, and Operation Paleologos would end in failure. This defeat marked the turning point in Europe, as both Warsaw and NATO troops would be forced on the defensive for years to come. Despite their show of unity and the valuable intel acquired from Paleologos, neither group was convinced that joint operations would be anything but costly and unproductive. Soviet troops fled eastward, effectively cutting off their Central European satellites from Russia. The Minsk Hive, its presence now undisputed, would go on to cripple the economies of the Eastern Bloc, causing further dread to loom over the whole of Europe. It was during these early years in which the ranks of East Germany's military gave rise to a series of influential heroes. General Alfred Strachwitz, commander of the Volksarmy's 1st Tank Corps, would become famous for his defensive battles along the Dnieper in Ukraine during the years leading up to Paleologos. Along with such a figure would one day be MiG-21 surface pilot Eurasia Bernhard, who would later serve with distinction throughout the retreat across Poland. Eurasia herself was the sister of NVA ace Captain Jürgen Bernhard, an accomplished war hero and pioneer of TSF development in East Germany. Not only was Jürgen responsible for advances in his own country's technology, but his development of combat doctrine regarding TSFs would one day be implemented across the world. In spite of the position and influence of these individuals, they would find themselves under threat, not by the Beta, but from their own government. The German Democratic Republic was a surveillance state, run by the oppressive Socialist Unity Party. Their employment of the infamous Ministry of State Security, a secret police otherwise known as the Stasi, led the citizens of the GDR to live in a constant state of paranoia against one another. It is said during these times that parents turned in their own children, and siblings turned upon one another under suspicions of disloyalty to the ruling party. Even with the war pressing closer and closer to East Germany's border, citizens were regularly told of the NVA's victories and success in pushing the Beta back across Europe. Their borders were safe, and their needs were provided for by the party. Any who had attempted to disrupt this truth by fleeing across the Berlin Wall were arrested by the Stasi, and often never seen again. Both General Strachwitz and Captain Jürgen Bernhard were among many officers to fall victim to the Stasi when elements of the military attempted a failed coup against the East German government. Eurasia Bernhard presented herself as a Stasi informant, with many directly attributing her in the death of her own brother. This gave her a position of influence within East Germany, where she would go on to obtain her successes in Poland as captain of the infamous 666 Squadron, the Schwarzesmarken, or Black Marks. With the fall of the Polish People's Republic in 1979, the National Volksarmy fell back to their absolute defense line along the Oder and Neisse rivers. The Oder-Neisse line was a series of fortifications and bases constructed to withstand the prolonged assault of the Beta advance. For the next 3 years, the people of East Germany lived in a constant hell. The Beta pressed in from the east, while the border to West Germany remained closed and always under the watchful eyes of the Stasi. Resource procurement and military production was increased, and everyday life was compelled by the government to continue as normal. This was East Germany's attempt to let the world know that it was a thriving nation, capable of withholding the Beta onslaught without international support. In reality, NATO and the West saw the East Germans as a necessary shield, the last holdout meant to buy time for nations of the European Union to evacuate and prepare for the eventual invasion of their home countries. All but the East German government and the Stasi acknowledged this, leading to their suppression of any attempt at dissidence in the citizenry. It was a time in which free speech and the rights of the governed mattered little when compared to the needs and reputation of the party. Not even religion was allowed, and quite literally, the people of the GDR were forced to abandon all hope of salvation. In January of 1983, the 666 Squadron, along with many NVA military units east of the Neisse River, moved to engage the Beta in an attempt to prevent the collapse of the Oder-Neisse line. In the vicinity of Cottbus Base, Fort Sprenberg, and Boxberg, the Beta would launch a massive attack across the river basin, with herds spanning as far north as Frankfurt. West German and UN-affiliated units would also conduct operations in the region, though as counterintelligence protocols dictated, neither military forces of the West or East actively shared a battlefield data link. NVA troops in the region fell under the overall command of Major Holzer Hannibal, commander of a task force often simply referred to as the Hannibal Battalion. The bulk of NVA forces along the front were made up of infantry, forced to fight with outdated trench warfare tactics. They were supported by T-72s, mortars, and machine gun emplacements. Along the Spree River, behind each of the forward bases, artillery and rocket batteries took up positions to provide indirect fire support, while behind the Elbe, the East German Air Force remained on standby, preparing to deploy over the battlefield once the airspace was secure. Across the Neisse, in the midst of the attacking beta, were clusters of laser class, numbering no less than 500 in total. With their ability to generate concentrated beams of radiation, both the laser class and its larger variant, the heavy laser class, were a completely effective means of area denial for all forms of aircraft within visual range. The tactical surface fighter, as a result, was at the center of combat doctrines to counter them. The Laserjagd, translated to laser hunt in English, was a tactic invented by the late Jürgen Bernhard, who was key in proposing that TSF doctrine was better focused around the suppression and surgical destruction of laser strains, as opposed to conventional, head-on clashes against beta herds. This tactic became the standard practice of securing artillery and aerial superiority over the battlefield, with TSFs rushing into the beta ranks in order to neutralize clusters of laser species. Utilizing the relatively cheap and outdated MiG-21 Balalaika, the NVA made regular use of squadrons launched for the purpose of these near-suicidal missions, of which Captain Iristina Bernhard and the Schwarzesmarken would prove themselves to be the masters of the Laserjagd. On January 6, beta groups began a brutal assault against the Oder-Neisse line. At Fort Sprenberg, the NVA 35th Infantry Regiment was among many which were forced to engage the beta in close-quarters combat. Over the course of 4 days, they repelled the attacks of tank-class beta, suffering extreme casualties within their blood-soaked trenches. By the 10th, command of these units would eventually fall into the hands of junior officers, such as Lieutenant Claudia Kornheim, whose company by then had been reduced to a quarter of its strength. Under fear of court-martial or worse by their political commissars, many of these battered units would refuse to retreat to their secondary defense lines. Armor and mortar support continued to hammer the enemy amidst a heavy snowstorm, but eventually, by 1100 hours, the 35th were among dozens of units to be completely overrun and annihilated. The NVA had been unable to effectively utilize artillery and air support due to the laser class. Nonetheless, heavy losses sustained by frontline armor and infantry were routinely expected along the defense line. The artillery instead focused on firing anti-laser shells east of the Neisse River basin. Upon being intercepted by enemy fire, the anti-laser munitions exploded into clouds of heavy metal, capable of temporarily disrupting laser irradiation. Follow-on bombardment would then reduce the number of laser class to slightly less than half of their original number. But failing to effect the full elimination of laser strains on the field, a Laserjagd operation was necessary and was quickly put into effect. Passing over the battle lines and the frozen Neisse at nap of Earth flight, at least 6 TSF squadrons advanced against the beta swarm. The 721st Squadron took the most direct route into the swarm, while the 611th flanked from the south along with 2 other squadrons. Flanking to the north was Captain Bernhard and the 666. In order to avoid laser fire, the TSF squadrons maintained an impossibly low altitude. Using whatever terrain they could to mask their approach, they ran the risk of colliding with the larger strains of Beta, already charging toward the defense line as well. The laser class never fired when other species of Beta were at risk of being hit. Using this knowledge, the laser yak units advanced at high speeds into the various packs of Beta, weaving around them in an attempt to close in on the laser strains without succumbing to their firepower. However, pushing directly into the herd, the 721st was immediately surrounded and cut off. Their intel of a secure and quick route had been wrong. Instead, they found themselves pinned down in a hectic battle with little cover and directly within range of multiple laser class. Amid the comms disruptions caused by the heavy metal clouds, the 721st made frantic requests for reinforcements among their allied squadrons. Bernhard's squadron received these transmissions, and much like with any other support request, they ignored it. Moving to support the isolated squadron would risk exposure to laser fire. As such, not a single unit would arrive to assist the now isolated and overwhelmed 721st. To the south, the 611th pressed forward along their route, yet their initial attempt at breaking through the enemy lines were unsuccessful. Their route had been blocked by a wall of Beta, forcing them into a direct engagement. With radio communications still offline, the 611th launched signal flares into the sky, indicating to the HQ at Coppice that they'd made contact with the enemy. The two squadrons supporting them were drawn into the same fight as well, delaying all units along the southern approach from their original mission. The battle was unforgiving, but the survival of the absolute defense line hinged upon the success of the Laserjagd. East German air units were scheduled to initiate bombardment of the target zone by 1200, and all TSF squadrons were encountering severe resistance due to the enemy's numerical superiority. This left the Schwarzesmarken. As the only unit still capable of breaking through enemy lines, Captain Bernhard made use of the sparse hills to conceal her squadron's maneuvers. At multiple points of their approach, they engaged tank and grappler class Beta in close proximity, maintaining their mobility while pushing deeper into hostile ground. Bernhard consolidated her squadron into a defensive formation, drawing in a large number of grappler class and eliminating them. The Schwarzesmarken then continued their advance, having to avoid both the merciless threat of laser fire, as well as confront a subterranean counterattack comprised of destroyer-class Beta. Always at the forefront of her unit, the captain herself was responsible for coordinating several daring maneuvers and placing her life on the line to ensure the success and survival of the squadron. With larger strains of Beta attacking them from all sides, the ace pilots used their proximity to the enemy to avoid being targeted. Breaking through at last, they rushed between the different groups of laser class, destroying one after another with deadly proficiency. By 1150 hours, the 611th finally broke through the enemy lines as well. Wherever they could, NVA surface pilots forced their way into the herd, locating and attacking all of the laser class that could be found. After a vicious struggle, the remaining TSF squadrons completed their objectives, eliminating the laser strains on the battlefield and securing the airspace from surface to air fire. As the rear lines of the Beta surged against them, all TSFs were cleared to take to the skies and withdraw. With her unit suffering only one casualty, Bernhard withdrew the 666 from the fighting as well. They retreated in the direction of Fort Sprenberg, just in time for the saturation attacks to rain down on the Beta in force. Fresh ground units of the NVA were rushed to the front lines, and the Beta advance was culled down to a manageable number. Meanwhile, To the north of the main engagement zone, elements of the West German Bundeswehr's 101st Tactical Armor Battalion had been fighting in and out of Polish territory for weeks across the Oder River. Swept up in the massive advance of the Beta herd, however, they were forced to take up defensive positions around the ruins of Krosno-Odrzański. Early on during the fighting, their battalion commander had been killed by laser fire, and command and control had rapidly deteriorated among their inexperienced pilots. A distress signal was sent out over UN channels, appealing to the NVA for assistance. While circumstances of the request remained unclear to Major Hannibal and his staff, he nonetheless was compelled to order the nearest available East German unit to rescue the isolated troops. Units at Hammer Base, however, were in the process of rearming and were unable to respond, and so the only TSF squadron available was the 666. The Schwarzesmarken had already survived a suicidal charge into the Beta sector. They were low on fuel and ammunition as well, and a second sortie across the line would be a risk both logistically and tactically. Nonetheless, Captain Bernhard directed the rest of her squadron to return to base, while she would follow through with the new orders from command. She would take only one other TSF to assist her, piloted by Lieutenant Theodor Eberbach. At Krosno-Odrzański, the more capable pilots of the 101st had managed to band together and eliminate the laser class suppressing them. With further successes of the Volksarmee units to their south, the airspace was once again clear. As the Beta closed in around them, and with their losses mounting, the surface pilots of the 101st took to the skies and began a disorderly retreat back across the Oder-Neisse line. Even as they abandoned their position, their distress signal had already been acknowledged by the NVA amid the confusion. On approach from the southwest, Bernhard and Eberbach were unable to make contact with the Bundeswehr unit, who by then had already fled. Only one of the F-4 Phantoms belonging to the 101st had remained at Krosno-Odrzański. But as soon as the MiG-21s pushed into the town, the lone F-4 was disabled by the enemy. The East German pilots were quick to act, moving to secure the downed TSF by eliminating the Beta scattered across the urban area. As Captain Bernhard provided cover, Lieutenant Eberbach dismounted and managed to safely rescue the West German pilot. With their mission complete, the pair of MiGs then withdrew back across the Oder-Neisse line. The enemy attack withered away as the East Germans shored up their defenses. Mop-up operations would continue throughout the day, until finally a reprieve was gained. The Beta had once again been repelled from the German border, but the cost was high, and although propaganda sources would tout the victories along the Oder-Neisse line, the soldiers on the front were confronted with the reality that it was only a matter of time until the East German military was completely exhausted. Larger, more dangerous herds of Beta would continue to pour out of the Minsk hive with every day it was allowed to grow. In a war of attrition against the extraterrestrial invaders, every success on the battlefield was temporary. To the East German troops, this victory had been no different. Fighting on the Oder-Neisse line was constant, never-ending. Not 1 week after the battle would Major Hannibal be killed during a Beta counterattack. There was no reprieve for the National Volksarmee. The Eastern Bloc was collapsing. Understanding the inevitable, NATO forces in the West strove to prolong the stability of their eastern shield, with preparations for a joint offensive already underway. For the people of the GDR, however, they stood trapped between the jaws of the ravenous Beta and the oppression of the Stasi. Little hope remained that the onslaught would end, and once the absolute defense line was eventually broken, the time for evacuation would be long past. But Iristina Bernhard and the Schwarzesmarken had long prepared to meet that end. and they stood ready to shoulder the future of their homeland, holding close what little hope there was that truly remained. We will continue to explore the expansive world of Muv-Luv Alternative, especially what we know of the Schwarzesmarken. A big thank you to all of the supporters on Patreon. If you would like to serve as part of an element, become a flight leader or squadron commander, there is a link in the description below. Your support will always accelerate the creation of these battle records.